Hello, my name is Dr. Jessica Mason. I'm a senior lecturer in the English language team at Sheffield Hallam University in the Humanities Department. And I'm recording this today to give you a little overview of some key issues in relation to language and gender, which I hope you'll find useful in your revision for your A-levels. So I'm going to just initially sort of talk about two different ways we can think about studying language and gender. This is a sort of a really kind of central aspect of linguistics study. It's something that's very common at university. In fact, this lecture material is largely taken from a first year undergraduate module that I run at Hallam called Language and Society. So I hope that this will be very useful for your A-level revision, also for those of you who may be thinking about potentially considering English or a language degree specifically at university. It'll give you a bit of a flavour of what that might be like. So really, there are two different ways that we can go about thinking about language and gender and studying it. We can think about analysing similarities and differences between how different genders are spoken and written about. So taking a text perhaps and seeing how men and women, males and females, people operating at different parts of the gender spectrum are talked about. And perhaps we might want to make some interesting comparisons about the verb choices that are used. Is one gender represented as being more active or having more agency or being more passive than another? Are there particular adjective choices that seem to be common to men and women? Are there different things that are focused on? Are we thinking about people's personalities or body types or what their body looks like? Are those things kind of talked about in different ways? So we could think about different topics and also different word choices that are used. We could also, though, think about analysing similarities and differences between how the different genders speak and write themselves. So this is a sort of a really central question that operates in an area of linguistics called sociolinguistics that's very interested in variation between people who have different characteristics. That's not something that we're just interested in relation to gender. It's also something that you will find lots of research around in relation to age. So do younger and older people speak in different ways, for example? Do people from different regions speak in different ways? We could talk about people with different backgrounds or who work in different professions, people of different races and ethnicities. So this is an area of study that is really interested in first thinking about whether or not there are differences between those different groups, and if there are, whether or not those are things that we can attribute to that particular characteristic. So in this case, we might say, well, we've noticed lots of differences between the way that this group of men and this group of women speak, but is that actually to do with the fact that they're men and women, or could that be, for instance, something to do with the context in which they're speaking that might offer us just as good an account as to why those variations occur? So this lecture is mainly going to focus on that second area, though I will sort of touch on other aspects as we go through. So first of all, I think it's really, really important for us to bear in mind that when we're thinking about talking about differences between, for example, how men and women speak, or how males and females speak, or masculine and feminine ways of speaking, and I'm going to introduce all three of these different ideas to you today as slightly different ways of talking about potential distinctions between the genders. It's really, really important that we understand what it is that we're talking about. And I think that often in the media, in public kind of discourse around gender, there can be some quite fundamental misunderstandings or miscommunications, getting it slightly not quite accurate in terms of the way that we talk about it. And so that's where I really want to start with this lecture. And in particular, we find that the idea about sex and gender are often conflated, which means they're sort of treated as the same when actually they're something different. So in general, I think it's fair to say that even though we've seen a lot of progress in the last few years around discussions around gender in the media, that in general, most people still see the world as being divided up into two sexes. So people will generally talk about men and women, and two genders that map onto those two sexes. So if you're a man, you're male. If you're a woman, you are female. However, it's quite a bit more complicated than that, and there's been a very long-standing history of research in all different areas, not just in kind of English language and linguistics, but also in biology, in psychology, in sociology, that would say that that's not necessarily quite an accurate way of talking about those two different things. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now just talking you through the distinctions. So sex and gender are really not the same thing at all. And when considering language and gender, it's therefore really important for us to understand this because it informs the way in which we investigate differences between potential different language patterns that we might observe between the genders. And linguistic investigations in this area are really interested in accounting for those differences of language between the sexes and gendered patterns of language. So we need to be really clear about who we're talking about and what we mean. So this idea of having two sexes and two genders that map onto them is often talked about, thinking about sex as a binary. So the bi part at the start of binary literally just means two. So you are one or the other. This sees sex as your biological characteristics. So it's typically to do with what's in someone's pants, or what we assume is in someone's pants. It also can come down to other aspects of anatomy. So perhaps we judge whether or not we think someone is a man or a woman when we see them walking down the street based on their anatomy, how they appear to us. We could also think about hormones and chromosomes. And we talk about males and females as being a prototypical combination of these. So normally, if we think about sex as a binary, we might think about someone who is male as having male genitalia, perhaps not having breasts, of having XY chromosomes and having a higher representation of testosterone than estrogen as the hormone that characterizes them in their body. Now, this is quite interesting, I think, because there are a lot of assumptions that we make about these things when actually it may be that we go through our entire lives and never know whether this is the case. We just assume that that is. So, for instance, I imagine that most of you, and certainly I, have never had my chromosomes tested. So I assume that based on the way that my body presents that I'm a woman. But actually, we find that around 1 in 100 babies are born with a body type that differs from this prototypical idea of a male or a female. Sometimes we can talk about this as people who are called intersex, so people who may perhaps have varying sets of genitalia. So they might have ovaries, but also have testes. We might talk about people who have a female set of genitalia, but actually if you did a chromosome test on them, that they would actually present with XX, which are female chromosomes. We might find that people have varying levels of testosterone or estrogen in their body. So actually 1 in 100 is quite high if you think about how many people perhaps are in your school or your college at the moment. That's quite a number of people, actually, if you think about the number of people you walk past in the street every day that don't fit this binary construction of sex. And Eckhart and McGonigal-Guinea argue that even sex, therefore, is in many ways a social construction. It's something that we treat as though it's a fact, but actually it's something that as a society we've constructed ideas around and we buy into those assumptions. And they carry on, they say sex is based on a combination of anatomical, so to do with your physical body, endocrinal, so that's to do with what goes on in your body, and chromosomal features. And the selection among these criteria for sex assignments is based very much on cultural beliefs about what actually makes someone male or female. And we can see this increasingly in the media as something that has been kind of resisted in very kind of strong terms of people who, now that we have a society which is much more accepting of people coming out and saying, I don't feel like I fit into this binary, that actually this seems to be something which is perhaps even more common than perhaps we believed in, and even back in 2003 when Eckhart and McGonigal-Guinea were writing. So what about gender then? Well, in contrast to sex, gender is largely to do with our sociocultural behaviour, and this can also inform when we walk past someone in the street and we make a split-second decision about whether we think that they are male or female. This can also be to do with all of these sociocultural behaviours, so the way that you dress, the way that you cut your hair, the way that you speak, the tone of your voice, for example, and the ways in which we live and express ourselves. So, for example, through these things like dress, disposition, interests, and these are often things that are termed kind of more masculine or feminine ways of being. So rather than talking about male and female or men and women, we could talk about things that are typically stereotypically associated with being more masculine or feminine. So in other words, it's perfectly possible to have prototypically masculine men, feminine women, but also more masculine women and more feminine men. And these are things that I think start to become really, really important when we think about wanting to investigate language and gender. And I'm going to suggest to you that, generally speaking, talking in these terms about things that are associated with being masculine or feminine is often a much more helpful way for us to go about talking about patterns in linguistic variation than talking about what men do and what women do. So as linguists, it's therefore really important for us to understand the difference between calling a behaviour something that men do, for instance, versus something that's viewed as a typically masculine behaviour. So if you look at some of the kind of the historic research around this area, I'm going to talk you through some of the history as to how we've kind of moved in language and gender studies through different phases, ways of talking and ways of thinking about these distinctions. But you'll find, if you go back into the 1970s, that there's loads of research that says things like swearing or interrupting is typically something that men do, and is something where if you go and record some men and some women for a certain period of time, that you might expect that men would interrupt, or certainly interrupt successfully, more than women, that they would probably swear more than women. As time has progressed, we've added a sort of layer of nuance to those conversations. So I think I would always suggest that talking about these things as things that are viewed as a masculine behaviour is a more helpful way of talking about that, and I'll explain that why I'm saying that as we go through the rest of the lecture. And I think Eckert and McGonigal have a really great thing to contribute to this. They say the eagerness of some scientists to establish a biological basis for gender difference and the public's eagerness to take these findings up points to the fact that we put a good deal of work into emphasising, producing and enforcing the dichotomous categories of male and female. So again, they're sort of feeding on that conversation that I showed you in the last slide, where yes, there are absolutely biological aspects to the sex. There are typical correlations between sex and gender, but that these are things that are very much socially constructed and culturally constructed understandings that we have about what it even means to be a man or a woman, let alone before we start talking about different ways in which men and women might speak, or things that men do or women do, such as swearing or interrupting. And this, I think, is a really useful representation of thinking about some of the complexities of gender. And I've copied a link to this and sent this to your teachers. So do feel free to have a look at it in more detail, because I can appreciate it's relatively small on this slide. But this is something called the Genderbread Person. It's been produced by many kind of charities and organisations that have been very interested in adding that additional layer of nuance to public understanding about gender. So they talk about all of these different things that can be tied up with gender that is not in any way to do, in many cases, with your anatomy or your chromosomes or your hormones. So we can talk about it in those terms. We can think about anatomical sex, but we can also think about gender expression. We can also think about gender identity, so how people identify, how they feel, which categories they feel that they fit into, or indeed whether they feel like they don't fit into categories at all. And actually often it's very, very common for people to not necessarily identify with aspects of the sex that they were born, the gender that people may have expected them therefore to have. And as people get older and get more confident in expressing this, you find more and more that people will often play around, perhaps even from day to day, the way in which they express their gender, or the way in which they feel their gender identity may be similar to, or may be very different from, the sex that they were assigned at birth. So this really sort of builds into the idea that there's been for many, many years, and I think that this has changed quite a lot in recent years, but a scientific bias towards a gender divide. And I've talked you through that quotation, so I'm not going to sort of linger on it now. But this, I suppose, is something where we could think about this as sex being something which has been useful from mainly a health and medical point of view for us to assign to babies and to adults for many, many years, that it doesn't necessarily map on strictly to the way in which people may want to express or discuss or identify their own gender. So what happens as a result of this, because it's something where, every baby that is born in a hospital will normally be assigned to be a boy or a girl, People may have gender reveal parties before that child is born. They may go home and people will buy them lots of clothes and give them a name and paint a room, and as they get older, encourage them into different hobbies or interests. What we find is that these things perpetuate lots and lots of stereotypes surrounding sex and gender, and that normally those stereotypes assume that sex and gender are the same thing. So they assume that people whose biological sex that they were assigned at birth was male, that they will be, their gender will be male. And so on. So one of the results of this persistence of this idea of binary sex and correlating binary genders is that there is this proliferation of stereotypes. And that's really a fancy way of saying, because many people tend to talk about sex and gender as though there are things that men do and things that women do, that creates stereotypes that we then have to navigate as individuals. And when we think about linguistically talking about things that men do and women do, that we encounter these kinds of stereotypes all the time. And because people believe them, they actually can be very, very powerful, whether or not they're true. So stereotypes really sit at the heart of all language and gender investigations, because even if they aren't true, they have power because people believe in them. So if people think that, for instance, that interrupting is a very masculine behaviour, and they think that that a woman should be ladylike, or should be passive, or should be kind, or should be nice, that they may interpret then a woman who interrupts quite often as being rude in a way that a man perhaps wouldn't have that set of assumptions placed on them because it's viewed as something which is a masculine behaviour. So those are the sort of ways that we can start to think about putting together that idea about stereotypes and navigating that linguistically and thinking about different language behaviours. And here's just, for your example, you can feel free to pause the video and have a read through of these. Here's some really common stereotypes about gender differences. These are ones actually that my current first years at Sheffield Hallam constructed and developed this list whilst we were discussing this topic as part of their undergraduate module. So I'll just give you a moment to just have a look through those things. So as with many stereotypes, perhaps you might think as you look through this list that you can think of lots of examples, lots of cases in which these things are actually true, but probably also lots of examples where perhaps you have friends who are women who do not have long hair, or you don't have long hair yourself, men who have long hair, perhaps women who go to work and earn more money than their male partner, people who are in partnerships that are same sex, which tend to get excluded often from these kinds of stereotypes. So they're often kind of lowest common denominator sort of assumptions about what's normal, what's typical, is a good way of thinking about these distinctions. And we see that this manifests and has done for many, many years throughout the media. So giving away my age a little bit here by this reference, but this is 18 years ago. It's not in the deep, dark kind of history of music performance. This was a song that was very, very popular back in 2003. Which I think even at that point we may have thought that we'd started to move away from some of these very stereotypical assumptions about gender, but we can see that this sort of sets up ideas about what men are like and what women are like, or in this case what girls and boys are like, that really, really kind of pushes these gender stereotypes. And there's lots of examples of this that we can see. So this, I suppose, perhaps fits more into that first category investigation that I was talking to you about at the start of the lecture, of thinking about how men and women are represented. And often I think that can tie up very closely with those assumptions that people then make about how men or women speak and how they behave, and what we consider or tie up with ideas about particular linguistic behaviours being masculine or feminine behaviours. So this has got sort of assumptions about presenting girls as people who like to go on holiday, like to have things bought for them, like to go shopping, and that men like to laugh at women's jokes even when they're not funny, and that if they've got fancy cars, that you're more likely to be successful romantically with women. So just an interesting example, I think, where we can tie those things together. So what I'd really like you to do now for a few minutes is just pause this video and have a ponder over this particular question, because I'm going to talk to you in a minute a little bit about the history of language and gender research, and that in particular this is an area of research that really came to prominence as a result of the feminist movement. But very often I think we can fall into the trap of talking about language and gender as though it's something which is problematic only for people who present as female, or people who were assigned female at birth, people who present as being women. And what I want to suggest to you is actually there are lots of ways in which these kinds of gender stereotypes can be oppressive to both men and women. So I'm going to give you a few minutes, just take as long as you'd like to, either if you're watching this on your own, to have a think about this yourself. If you're watching this in class, then have a chat with your neighbours. But imagine that you were going to be asked to write something about this statement: gender stereotypes can be oppressive to both men and women, and see what you come up with. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you've unpaused the video, and I'm just going to move forwards to what I think is a really nice, interesting example of this. And if you're ever interested in doing kind of coursework around language and gender, this speech by Emma Watson back in 2014, I think, is a really, really interesting example of challenging this idea that gender stereotypes are only oppressive to women. This is something which you may have heard the term kind of knocked about in the news, is sometimes kind of called this idea about toxic masculinity, that there are ideas about, because we have stereotypes that we put on women, there are also stereotypes that we associate with men, and that can create a pressure for men to behave in a particular way which is often not helpful to either themselves or to other people around them. Now, at the same time, though, that Emma Watson, and I'll read this quotation that I've picked out of her very interesting speech for you, is sort of challenging this idea, and sort of saying, men should be as interested in genders being treated equally and fairly as women should be. But at the same time, the campaign was actually called He for She. So there's an interesting sort of division even within that title of something which is a very kind of progressive crying out for thinking about embracing the idea of everybody being interested in gender equality, that there is still this representation of that binary of he for she, and that men should be doing something for women, which I think is an interesting thing that perhaps merits reflection. So in this speech, Emma Watson, I think, summarised this really nicely. She said, "Men don't have the benefits of equality either. We don't often talk about men being imprisoned by gender stereotypes, but I can see that they are, and that when they are free, things will change for women as a natural consequence. If men don't have to be aggressive in order to be accepted, women don't feel compelled to be submissive. If men don't have to control, women don't have to be controlled. Both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum instead of two sets of opposing ideals." There's an interesting text, I think, for us to reflect on there as well. So what I'm going to just do now briefly is to kind of walk you through a very kind of whistle-stop tour of the various levels of progression that we've had in relation to the study of language and gender, that I think moved from this very kind of binary characteristic way of thinking about gender, of thinking about men and women and what men and women do, to something that, as conversations about gender have become more nuanced and more open in more recent years, that we've moved through from generally talking about things that men and women do, or male and female language behaviours, to things that we may prototypically associate with being masculine or feminine, and that those are interesting things for us to consider and investigate, and the ways in which people navigate and appropriate those different stereotypes. So we can see that we start, this is back in sort of the 1970s, with the deficit and dominance approach. We then moved for a period of around 8 to 10 years in this area of research into talking more about difference than deficit or dominance, and that we've now moved into what I refer to as sort of a constructivist or a socially constructivist way of talking about gender. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking you through these three things now. So the deficit or dominance approach, and it's often kind of called one or the other interchangeably, but is generally referring to the same set of ideas, is something which started around the 1970s, and Robin Lakoff, who is a female researcher who was very politically active as a feminist, also was really kind of one of the key names that characterized this movement. And it really came from a recognition that at that time that there were all sorts of problems with how women were being treated, in particular in the workplace, and that perhaps that they were not being promoted at the same rates as men, that there were pay gaps, that there were differences in what kind of jobs were available to women, what sort of salary they might expect to receive, and so on and so on. And Robin Lakoff and a team of researchers around the same kind of phase were really interested in understanding this better. And Deborah Cameron, who I would really, really recommend as a fantastic researcher in this area, who in fact runs a blog that you can find on Google, where she writes about all sorts of different topics to do with language and gender. But she sort of, in this article that I'm quoting from here, is really taking a kind of a look back over language and gender studies since it first kind of came to the fore in the 1970s. And this is what she says. She says the linguistic gender differences these researchers, so she's talking about people like Robin Lakoff, sought to identify and explain, were not treated as expressions of the innate dispositions of men and women, but as the results of a patriarchal socialization which produced the groups as different and unequal. So patriarchal kind of means a society which has been designed for, or is largely still kind of controlled and run by men. So she's saying that initially these sets of researchers, especially as feminist researchers, came along and said this is how the world has been set up, and because it's set up in that way, women are being systematically disadvantaged in every aspect of life, but in particular they were very interested in the workplace. So, for instance, Robin Lakoff, Deborah Cameron continues, famously characterised what she called women's language as a marked register indexing feminine gender, as a display of the subordinate status to which women in patriarchal societies were condemned. Its hallmarks were powerlessness, insecurity, and triviality. So this, I think, is really important for us to pause on and really understand. So Robin Lakoff was not saying, women are not as good as men. She absolutely wasn't saying that. What she was saying was, because society's been set up in these particular ways, it's encouraging women to be subordinate, and that is reflected in their language choices. And because that's reflected in their language choices, it's kind of keeping them in that subordinated position relative to men. So when we think about, for instance, many of these kind of common stereotypes that persist today, about women being more passive, about them being quiet, about them not interrupting, about perhaps them speaking in softer tones, or not being assertive, of gossiping and talking about topics that aren't particularly important, being more interested in talking about shopping or shoes, or what her next door has been doing with her baby this week and whether or not we approve of it. Those are the kinds of things that Robin Lakoff was sort of talking about. She's saying through in many ways no fault of their own, that women have been put into a situation where these are the things that they are encouraged to kind of talk about, and the ways in which they're encouraged to talk. And what it's creating is this thing called women's language, which is lesser than men's, and is allowing men to continue to be dominant, and is in fact not only allowing men to continue to be dominant, but is encouraging them to continue to be dominant, because women are behaving and talking in a way which subordinates them through their own language use. So you can see that a lot of those kinds of stereotypes that still persist today around things like interruption and swearing and gossiping really stem from these same recognitions, but we talk about them perhaps in very different ways now. And this, I think, is something, if you want to see a really good example of this, and in particular why this way of talking about language and gender really kind of fell out of fashion around the 1980s, is Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In. Now, Sheryl Sandberg is a female CEO of Facebook. And this book that she wrote was called Lean In, was very, very, very popular when it came out. But as time has progressed, has drawn some, I think, important critiques, which from a language and gender point of view, it is really important for us to consider, because what it really perpetuates is this dominance and deficit approach. She essentially says in this book, and that's why it's called Lean In, that she is obviously a very, very successful woman professionally. She's had a career. I think she's also got about five or six children, and she's managed to successfully rise to the top of Facebook, being this incredibly powerful role. And she sort of narrates throughout this book this idea that, you know, she's seen lots and lots of female colleagues who have not risen to the same kind of professional standing that she's done because they don't lean in at the table. So when she's in these big important meetings, men lean in and women lean back. Men will assert themselves and offer their opinion, offer their point of view, and women don't do that. Men interrupt and don't feel bad about it, whereas women don't. So this book by Sheryl Sandberg was really kind of a rallying cry to women to say, you know, you need to lean in at the table. If you want the jobs that men have, then you need to behave in a male way in order to do that. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is it sounds like, in many ways, really solid advice, but when we start to investigate it from a linguistic point of view, we can see all sorts of problems that arise from it. And this is really what these kinds of critiques that have been levied at Sheryl Sandberg's book were the same critiques that were levied at the dominance and deficit approach, which led to something that is often referred to as kind of the celebration moment in language and gender studies, a shift to something called the difference approach. Because, of course, what you tend to find is that if there are stereotypical assumptions that men lean in at the table, men interrupt, men are assertive, then when they behave in those ways, they are often either rewarded for those behaviours or nobody bats an eyelid at it, nobody raises an eyebrow about it. When women engage in those behaviours, in those kinds of contexts, they often attract negative remarks, negative attitudes, because it's viewed as something which is kind of unladylike or unfeminine. So a man who is assertive will often be called, you know, really powerful or really impressive. A woman who interrupts will often be called bossy or rude. So this was really kind of the challenge that was sort of being pointed at Sheryl Sandberg's advice of saying, you know, this sounds really great, but actually we tend to find that the advice that you're offering results in women continuing to be oppressed and continuing to be subordinated and continue to be treated differently. Because essentially what you're saying is, in order to be successful, you need to stop behaving like a woman and start behaving like a man, and you need to get rid of this woman's language because it's not very good, and if you adopt male ways of speaking and male ways of being, you'll be successful. But of course everybody will still recognize the fact that you are a female engaging in those behaviors, and that carries with it its own set of problems. So when we get to hitting kind of like the mid 1980s, 1990s in language and gender research, these kinds of critiques had come to the fore and really created a shift in the way that theorists talked about language and gender. So they started to point to actually saying, well, yes, we can observe that there are these different patterns in the way that perhaps men and women speak. But a lot of the ways in which the women are speaking are actually much more successful linguistically in terms of achieving the things that the women want to than men do. So talking about things like being cooperative in talk, so not interrupting all the time, letting people take their turn, letting everybody kind of be heard, was identified as actually something which was often a much more successful strategy for getting a business to function successfully, to getting a meeting to run successfully. So that really this advice about saying, well, this women's language is kind of trivial, it's powerless, it's not very good, everybody should be being aggressive, everybody should be trying to be dominant, everyone should be trying to be assertive, was actually really counterproductive. And so rather than talking about deficits, so something that women's language lacks in relation to men, people shifted to starting to talk about difference instead, that actually men and women tend to speak differently and that we can observe gendered patterns of language use, and that really what we should be doing is celebrating women's linguistic habits as being really skillful, as being something which has lots of benefits of its own. So it's not something which is deficient, it's just something that is different. And this is really where language and gender studies stayed for quite a long time, I would say, through the 1980s, probably up to about the mid-1990s. And again, Deborah Cameron, reflecting on this in this really fantastic article where she talks about the history of gender and language studies, describes it in this way. So she talks about people like Deborah Tannen as being researchers who would really characterize this cultural difference approach. So saying later on, the so-called cultural difference researchers, the best known of whom is Deborah Tannen, would argue that the linguistic gender differences were produced not by subordination of women as such, but by the social arrangements which separates the genders in the formative period of childhood and adolescence. Boys and girls, it was argued, learn different ways of speaking in the same-sex peer groups where their main socialization takes place. So really looking for an account of this, Deborah Tannen and researchers like her argued that when we have little boys and little girls, and they go to playgroup or they socialize with other little boys and girls, that we tend to put them together with children who present, certainly at that age, as the same sex as them. And we tend to give them different activities to do. And because we do that, as a result, it creates these differences, which when people then get older and become adults, that we can then observe these different patterns of perhaps women gossiping and men shouting and women being more cooperative, is because, she would argue, that's because when you have little boys, you put them all together, you tell them all to go and play cops and robbers, or you send them off to climb trees and tree houses, and it involves lots of shouting at each other and lots of assertive things, whereas little girls will be encouraged to bake cookies and play house or play doctor and nurse, or sit and talk in kind of kitchens together, and that as a result there is this kind of difference that evolves as a result of the way in which society is set up. So again, just like with this earlier set of researchers, she was still really pointing towards the fact that there was a very strong belief that these gender differences do exist, and that they are produced by the way in which society is structured, but that this was something where the real kind of shift, I suppose, in the way in which this was talked about, was that this is different but equal. So it's not that men talk in this way, and if women want to get on and be treated equally, then they should behave in these more kind of male ways, but that actually we should recognize that these different ways in which men and women tend to talk and tend to behave are of equal value, even though they are different. Now, this is something which I think still has traces in the research today. And here I've got an example for you from Talbot of talking about these kinds of characteristic ways of talking about these different differences and what they look like. So Talbot would tend to say that the kind of more female ways of speaking tend to be people who adopt more of kind of a carer role, that they are centered around building rapport, of being more kind of private, of being more supportive, of being intimate, of being okay, of talking about emotions and making connections with people. And that more masculine or male ways of talking tend to be oriented around this idea of having an identity as a breadwinner, and telling people about what you do, being more kind of open and public about it being much more acceptable to be defiant or oppositional or assertive, of being characterized by independence rather than intimacy, and seeking out of status. Some of the critiques that then started to come to the fore of even this approach, I think, are interesting for us to then sort of pause on. And again, you can see that perhaps there are scenarios in which we might think about these as being, in a sense, true of having particular characteristics that are perhaps more associated with men than women, or vice versa. But one of the things that Talbot talked about and really problematized in relation to this difference approach was that it still tended to see all of these differences as starting from gender, of being things that men do and women do. It tended to reproduce stereotypes rather than challenge them, and reproduce them as though they were the truth. So even though talking about these things of, well, women just talk differently, but that's still really valuable, is making assumptions that women talk differently in the first place, and then holding up those particular kind of ideas, which in particular can be oppressive to people who don't fit neatly into those particular stereotypes. So thinking about, for example, Sheryl Sandberg saying, well, you need to, it's just as valuable to talk about these things, but you should be leaning in at the table. Well, actually, perhaps women already do lean in at the table, and that's not what the problem is when we look at gaps in how many women are occupying those kinds of top roles and CEOs of companies. So it makes that assumption that gender is at the root of these differences that we observe. And as a result, the critique that was sort of levied is that tends to therefore reproduce those stereotypes as though they were the truth. And it fails to confront gender power, this different but equal rhetoric. Talbot suggests kind of is inadvertently still keeps women in their place, because it suggests, well, you just talk differently and that's fine, that's really great, so please continue to carry on letting people interrupt you, and feeling like you can't be assertive and being called bossy if you speak up in a meeting. So an interesting, again, sort of kind of nuance that you often find in all sorts of research, and I think is particularly characteristic of language and gender, is that the field will sort of take up a set of ideas, it will buy into them for a few years, and then as people start to investigate them further, we will kind of build on that and progress. And so just like with the deficit and dominance approach, the difference approach started to attract critiques in a similar way. And that really led us to this kind of third wave of language and gender studies, which I would suggest is still really the place that language and gender studies is operating in at the moment, which is often referred to as the social constructionist or constructivist way of talking and thinking about language and gender. And this, I would really suggest to you, is perhaps I would consider the most useful and most nuanced way of talking about patterns that we might want to observe or might want to investigate in relation to the language of people who present as male, present as female, or indeed present anywhere else along that spectrum of gender or sex. And this idea really said that women and men both draw on features of language at any given point, and that this can change from day to day, from moment to moment, depending on what context you're in and who you're talking to. That we draw on features of language that index, which just means signal, masculinity or femininity in order to do being a man or being a woman or behaving in a more prototypically male or female way. So you may find, for instance, that if you get a woman who is in a male-dominated profession, who occupies a very kind of senior role in that organization, that when she's in a meeting, she may adopt features of language that index or signal masculinity, because these are typically associated with things like being more assertive. And then when she goes home or goes out with her friends, those features of language may disappear completely and may become much more representative of language features that index femininity. And we may see exactly the same vice versa. So women adapt to masculine contexts and men to feminine contexts by using features of language that index masculinity or femininity. So, for example, there have been studies that have found that women in stereotypically male jobs, such as the police force or construction, will often deepen their voices, that they will swear a lot in order to kind of be accepted in that environment. And men working in clothing shops or caring for children, or perhaps working in school roles, especially in primary school contexts, will often soften their voices and use vocabulary in terms of endearment or a greater variety of adjectives appropriate to the setting. So this is something that really kind of said, let's get rid of this idea of talking about sex and gender as a binary of things that men do and things that women do, because actually all we're doing, as long as we're doing that, is excluding a huge proportion of the population who don't fit neatly into those stereotypes anyway, because we're just treating them as though they're too complicated for us to be interested in, when in fact their language is really, really fascinating for us to explore as language and gender experts and analysts. So let's get rid of that. Let's think about diversity of different ways in which people represent themselves along the full spectrum of kind of gender identification, but also in lots of different contexts. So let's continue to talk about things that are masculine and feminine language features, because there are stereotypical assumptions that make them be treated as though these are ways of behaving that are masculine and feminine. But let's not forget that these things are all socially constructed and that they vary in really interesting ways. And so once we started to shift to this kind of phase of language and gender studies, we started to see the emergence of lots of really interesting studies that looked in particular at people whose gender identity didn't neatly conform to the sex that they were assigned at birth. And this, I think, really kind of drew to the fore this idea that gender is something that we constantly perform, and we perform in different ways. We do being a man or being a woman or somewhere in between in different ways. So, for example, Hall interviewed phone sex workers who said that they used feminine words, e.g. sort of there's a very kind of common thing that women will tend to use a more diverse range of terms to refer to colours than men will. So where men, a prototypically masculine way of talking about colour might be to say that something's blue, that a woman may be more likely to say, well, it's turquoise, it's light blue, it's sky blue, it's eggshell blue. And lilting intonation to create a persona based on a stereotype of middle-class women, even if those phone workers were not a middle-class white woman themselves. Barrett equally, and you can kind of see here, I think, through these studies, that there started to be a real interest about thinking about how race and ethnicity interacted with these things as well. So Barrett looked at African American drag queens in the States and identified that actually one of the really interesting things that they were doing in their language behaviors, and they were people who were assigned male at birth, who typically identify as being male, but often dress up in feminine garb and put makeup on, and often very sort of elaborate, beautiful kind of dresses, and then perform as a woman. That what they were doing was appropriating these refined white women's speech of using terms like marvelous or darling or sweetie, having this very kind of crisp RP sort of accent, sort of received pronunciation, things, to perform being female in that particular context when they were doing drag, and that when they were not in drag, that they spoke actually in a completely different way that typically had more of those indexed features of masculine speech. So really, really pointing to this idea that gender is something that we can perform, and that one of the ways in which we can perform it is through our language use. And this, I think, is a really kind of nice place for us to bring this idea together, because Judith Butler, very, very renowned gender studies theorist, talks about this idea about gender as a performance. And I think this is a really useful way for us to think about approaching any instance of a person who is talking, whose language we might want to analyze, when we're thinking about it through this lens of, are they indexing more kind of male or female behaviors? This idea that gender is something that you perform, and that actually those stereotypes that were historically viewed as very oppressive and can be very oppressive about things that men do or women do, are things that people can appropriate and take and use to empower themselves to perform gender in exactly the way that they may wish to do so. And Cameron, I think, summarizes this again really nicely. She talks about gender as a performance as not something a person has, but as something a person does by repeatedly performing acts that constitute masculinity or femininity. So this idea that gender is something that we constantly construct and which changes depending on the context we find ourselves in, depending on how we want to express ourselves in a given context. So when performing gender, we often actually exploit those stereotypical associations with masculinity and femininity, so far from being kind of oppressed by them, that we take those assumptions. And so if you are a woman who is wanting to index a very masculine identity, that you take exactly those things that people have said are not like kind of ladylike ways of doing in order to perform that gender. So perhaps you are very assertive and very direct, and you interrupt and you swear more. So thinking about those women working in the police force or in construction, that this often offers a kind of better account of what's actually really going on here. And Cameron sort of summarizes, rather than just artlessly displaying stable pre-existing identities or attitudes, she's talking about a particular kind of research study here that's drawn from this social constructivist movement. So rather than just artlessly displaying stable or pre-existing identities or attitudes, so that's really this idea that, you know, we're born as a man or a woman, and then we get encultured, we learn a particular way of speaking, and then we just do it, and it's artless, it's not something that we really think about. She says it's actually really, really much more impressive than that. These informants are shown to be carefully managing their self-presentation, anticipating and working to deflect potential perceptions of them as either insufficiently or excessively masculine or feminine. That these are choices that we make, that are active, that are nuanced, that are skillful, that result in people having different perceptions of the gender identity that we are expressing, that may or may not map up with the sex that we were assigned at birth. So that's where I'm going to finish this lecture. I hope it's been a good refresher for you, and it's something that you will kind of find useful. I've got some useful references for you here. In particular, this 2005 article by Deborah Cameron, I think, is a really, really good overview of historical kind of approaches and changes in the field of language and gender. So thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in finding more about studying English, whether that's language or other kind of aspects of it, in particular at Hallam, there's a link for you just here. And you are, of course, always very welcome to email me if you've got any questions. So my name is just Dr. Jessica Mason, and this is my email address, which I will put in the link for this video as well. So thank you very much for listening. Very, very best of luck with your language investigations. And I hope that you have a lovely rest of your week.